Proof 6. Jesus is seated on his throne, signifying that the work of dealing with sin is finished. All throughout Hebrews, as well as elsewhere, like the book of Acts. The biblical writers go to great lengths to talk about Jesus being seated on his throne. Again, the original audience of the Hebrews understood the Old Testament very well. And when they would have heard this, they would have understood how stark a contrast this was to the Levites. For starters, the Levites were not kings. There was no throne for them to sit on in the tabernacle, though the mercy seat is the equivalent of such because God's manifest presence. But it wasn't for them to sit on in the tabernacle. And they never sat down because their work of dealing with sin was forever ongoing. In Hebrews 10, 8 through 14, the author gives us a picture of this complete, or gives us a picture of this compare and contrast. Notice. When he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. These are offered according to the law. Then he added, behold, I have come to do your will. He does away with the first in order to establish the second. And by that will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. The difference between experiential and positional sanctification, another topic we're going to talk about in the coming weeks. And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. Thus the reading of God's holy word. Notice, Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins. And in doing so, we've been sanctified. Goes on to say, those who are being sanctified. Again, we will talk about experiential and positional sanctification in another night. But the author tells us it was not God's plan for sacrifice to take place indefinitely for the rest of existence. And God did away with the first covenant, abrogating it by inaugurating the new. And remember in the previous chapter, he went through this already, some of which we saw earlier. This was done by the once for all time single sacrifice of Christ. Then verse 11, what does he say? That the Levitical priests stood daily at his office, which was the work of dealing with sin. That was their job. And they did so by repeatedly offering sacrifices for sin, which could never actually take it away. But unlike them, Christ offered himself one time, actually put sin away at the cross, like we just saw in Hebrews 9:26, and then did what? Entered into the presence of God and sat down at the right hand of God, where he will remain until all of his enemies are made a footstool. And his single sacrifice actually perfects all of those for whom it was made, which are the individuals that God is presently sanctifying by the power of the Holy Spirit. This is what Christ is presently doing, folks. He is ruling and reigning as a priest king, because Hebrews 7:1 says that Melchizedek was both a priest and a king simultaneously. The Levites were only priests, which is why they didn't have a throne to sit on. It is very telling that the SDA fundamental belief number 24 on the investigative judgment in the sanctuary says absolutely nothing about the kingship of Christ. And this is because they don't teach he's actually functioning as a king right now, ruling and reigning over his kingdom. We have looked at this before and listened to numerous SDA figures talk about this, and we have seen how they say he will receive his kingdom after the investigative judgment is complete, because Jesus' kingdom is the people that make it up, not territorial. And since the investigative judgment is where it is being determined who is and isn't fit for his kingdom, something else we saw earlier, Jesus isn't actually functioning as a king right now. This ultimately is coming from a vision from Ellen White, something else we've looked at numerous times, where she claims in the future he will cease being a priest, taking off his priestly garments and putting on his kingly ones. But no, they have it totally backwards. Christ is simultaneously a priest and a king right now. The fact that he is seated represents the fact that he isn't still dealing with sin anymore, like the Levitical priests who were always standing. On top of this, if an Adventist wants to make the argument that what was on earth was identical to what is in heaven, only what was on earth was a scaled down version, then they need to provide an example for us where there was a throne for the Levites to sit on. Not just that, but based on Ellen White's alleged vision, there's apparently 2 thrones, with one in the holy place, outer apartment. Then they got up off the throne and moved into the holy place. Yeah, that doesn't sound like it was identical to what was on earth. But that's proof 6. Jesus is seated as a priest king and is presently making all of his enemies his footstool as he rules and reigns with all authority in heaven and on earth. He's not dealing with sin anymore, let alone did he begin expiating it in 1844.